The night of July 24th, 1943. Somewhere over the North Sea, Flight Lieutenant David Morrison gripped a brown paper bag in his gloved hands. Inside were 2,200 strips of aluminum-coated paper, each precisely 10.5 inches long, 3/4 of an inch wide. Nothing about them looked like a weapon. They looked like trash. Like someone had taken kitchen foil and cut it into confetti. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But Morrison knew better. In exactly 8 minutes, when his Lancaster bomber crossed into German airspace at 19,000 feet, he would tear open this bag and throw its contents into the screaming darkness. And when he did, 50 million Reichsmarks worth of German radar technology, the most sophisticated air defense network ever built, would go blind. The bag crinkled in his hands. Morrison's wireless operator, Tommy Walsh, watched from his position behind the pilot's seat. "Looks like we're about to confuse the hell out of Jerry with garbage," Walsh muttered through the intercom. Morrison didn't respond. He was counting seconds, watching the stopwatch strapped to his kneeboard. The orders were specific. 1 bag every minute. Precise timing. No exceptions. Below them, invisible in the darkness, the Kammhuber line waited. 15 radar stations, each one a death sentence, each one equipped with Freya early warning systems and Würzburg tracking radars that could lock onto a bomber at 30 miles and guide night fighters directly to its position. The Germans called each station a Himmelbett, a 4-poster bed. The RAF called them something else, a shooting gallery where British bombers died in predictable patterns. Tonight, that was about to change. Morrison looked at his stopwatch. 7 minutes. He thought about the Welsh woman who'd invented what he was holding, a physicist named Joan Curran, who'd spent months cutting different sizes of metal strips with household scissors, testing them against radar installations, searching for the exact dimensions that would make German technology worthless. She'd found it. Now 791 bombers were carrying her invention toward Hamburg, and none of the German radar operators had any idea what was coming. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The timeline that led to this moment stretched back 3 years. To a cluttered laboratory near Swanage, England, where the impossible had seemed routine and the desperate had become necessary. February 1942. Telecommunications Research Establishment, Swanage. Joan Struthers Curran sat at a metal table covered in wire cuttings, aluminum sheets, and rejected prototypes. Her hands were raw from cutting metal. Her laboratory coat had small tears from sharp edges. Outside, German bombers were hitting British cities with terrifying regularity, guided by their own radar systems, protected by defensive networks the RAF couldn't penetrate. Joan was 25 years old. She studied physics at Cambridge's Newnham College, earned honours in a program that didn't award her an actual degree because Cambridge didn't give degrees to women. She'd joined the Cavendish Laboratory to pursue doctoral work under Philip D., showing what colleagues called the scientific equivalent of gardening green fingers, an intuitive understanding of experimental apparatus that made complex problems seem solvable. Then the war intervened. Dee's entire research group transferred to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough on September 1st, 1939. 2 days later, Britain declared war on Germany. Instead of returning to academic research, Joan and her research partner, a physicist named Samuel Curran, joined a team developing proximity fuses for anti-aircraft weapons. They married in November 1940. 4 months later, both transferred to the Telecommunications Research Establishment, where Sam worked on centimetric radar and Joan joined the countermeasures group in an adjacent laboratory. Her new assignment came with a single question that had tormented British military planners since 1941. How do you blind German radar? The problem was straightforward. German radar technology operated on known wavelengths. Radio waves transmitted from ground stations, reflected off aircraft, returned to receivers, appeared as blips on circular screens. The system worked with brutal efficiency. RAF Bomber Command losses averaged 4 to 5% per mission, sometimes higher. On bad nights, 1 in 10 bombers failed to return. The mathematics were unsustainable. At those rates, bomber crews had a life expectancy measured in missions, not months. British intelligence knew the German system intimately. An operation called Biting, a commando raid on a German radar installation at Bruneval, France, in February 1942, had brought back critical components from a Würzburg radar. Engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment disassembled it, measured its operating frequencies, calculated its capabilities. The report was definitive. German radar operated primarily in 3 frequency bands. The equipment was sophisticated, accurate, and vulnerable to a specific kind of interference. Theoretical vulnerability meant nothing without practical application. Joan's task was to find the practical application. The concept was simple. If you could create thousands of false radar returns, you could swamp German screens with so many targets that real bombers became invisible. The execution was anything but simple. She started with wire, thin copper strands cut to half the wavelength of German radar frequencies. Physics dictated that any conductive material, when cut to half the wavelength of incoming radar waves, would resonate and re-radiate the signal, creating a false echo. The theory was sound. The practice failed immediately. Wires tangled. They fell in clumps. They didn't disperse properly when dropped from aircraft. German radar operators would see a single mass, not multiple targets. Joan tried sheets next. Larger pieces of aluminum foil that could reflect radar signals more effectively. These worked better but presented different problems. Sheets were heavy. They fell too quickly. They didn't stay airborne long enough to create sustained interference. And they required too much material per bomber. You couldn't load enough sheets into a Lancaster to blind radar for more than a few minutes. For months, the countermeasures group tested variations. Different metals, different sizes, different deployment methods. Joan worked with methodical precision, cutting samples at her kitchen table with household scissors, taking them to test sites, dropping them from aircraft at Christchurch Aerodrome, observing their effects on radar screens at ground stations. Most attempts failed. Some showed promise but insufficient effect. The perfect solution remained elusive. Then, in early 1942, she found it. Strips of aluminum foil laminated onto paper, each one precisely 25 centimeters long, 1 to 2 centimeters wide. The paper backing added just enough weight to prevent the strips from tangling while keeping them light enough to flutter and disperse in the slipstream of a bomber. When dropped in bundles, the strips created a cloud of metallic confetti that hung in the air for minutes. Each individual strip resonating at German radar frequencies, each one producing a false return on enemy screens. The first test was extraordinary. Joan arranged for an aircraft to drop bundles of her strips over a radar station. Operators watching their screens saw what appeared to be a massive fleet of bombers, dozens of targets where only one aircraft existed. The effect was, in the words of her husband Sam, truly amazing. The thin metal strips had done what months of sophisticated engineering couldn't accomplish. They'd made one airplane look like 50. But having a solution and using it were different problems entirely. March 1942. Air Ministry, London. Professor Frederick Lindemann, the British government's chief scientific advisor, sat in a conference room reviewing Joan Curran's test results. The data was impressive. The potential was obvious. Lindemann's response was immediate and unequivocal. Absolutely not. His reasoning was coldly logical. The moment Britain used this radar countermeasure, Germany would copy it. German scientists weren't stupid. They'd pick up the fallen strips, analyze them, deduce their function, and within weeks, possibly days, German bombers would be using the same technique against British radar defenses. The Luftwaffe, which had reduced its bombing campaign against Britain but hadn't abandoned it entirely, would gain a tool that could blind British coastal radar, fighter command defenses, anti-aircraft artillery guidance systems. The risk outweighed the benefit. That was Lindemann's assessment, and he had the authority to enforce it. Anti-Aircraft Command agreed. The device would remain classified, unused, a brilliant solution locked in a filing cabinet because deploying it might cause more harm than good. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris disagreed. Harris commanded RAF Bomber Command, and he watched his crews die at rates that made operational planning a macabre mathematics exercise. 4% losses per mission meant bomber crews had a statistical survival rate of roughly 25 missions. Many didn't last that long. Hamburg alone had cost the RAF 12 air. Berlin had been worse. The Ruhr Valley was a graveyard. Harris wanted Joan, Curran's invention. He called it Window, the official British code name. He argued for its deployment repeatedly throughout 1942 and early 1943. Each time, Fighter Command and Anti-Aircraft Command blocked him. The debate escalated to the War Cabinet. Prime Minister Winston Churchill listened to both sides. Lindemann warned of German retaliation. Harris described bomber crews burning alive over German cities while a proven countermeasure sat unused in laboratories. The stalemate continued for 18 months. During that time, RAF bomber losses mounted. German radar technology improved. The Kammhuber line expanded, adding more stations, more night fighters, more sophisticated tracking systems. By spring 1943, German night fighter forces had become devastatingly effective. The Luftwaffe's General Joseph Kammhuber had organized a defensive network that killed British bombers with industrial efficiency. Then the strategic situation shifted. By June 1943, the Luftwaffe had transferred most of its bomber forces to the Eastern Front. Russian cities, not British ones, were absorbing the weight of German air attacks. The risk Lindemann feared, massive German raids on Britain using captured radar countermeasure technology, had diminished substantially. The bulk of Luftwaffe bombers were now 3,000 miles east, supporting ground operations against the Soviet Union. Harris renewed his arguments. This time, the War Cabinet listened differently. The Americans were arriving in force. The Combined Bomber Offensive, a joint RAF and US Army Air Force campaign to destroy German industrial capacity, required unsustainable losses to be reduced. New centimetric radar systems being deployed to British fighters would be less vulnerable to the same countermeasure techniques. The balance of risk had shifted. On July 15, 1943, the War Cabinet authorized the use of Window in combat operations. Harris immediately ordered it deployed for Operation Gomorrah, a sustained bombing campaign against Hamburg scheduled to begin in 9 days. The target was Germany's second-largest city, a major port, home to shipyards building U-boats, a hub of industrial production crucial to the German war effort. Hamburg's defenses were formidable. Himmelbett radar stations, 9 night fighter bases, hundreds of searchlights, radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, and a civil defense network prepared for air raids. The Germans expected raids. They'd endured them before. What they didn't expect was strips of aluminum-coated paper falling from the sky at precisely timed intervals, turning their entire defensive network into useless hardware. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. July 24th, 1943, 2100 hours. RAF Scampton, Lincolnshire. Number 76 Squadron, assembled in their briefing room. These were the first aircrew trained in window deployment. 24 crews, each assigned to a Lancaster bomber loaded with bundles of the metallized paper strips. The briefing officer, a squadron leader named Pemberton, stood before a wall map showing Hamburg's location and the flight path across the North Sea. "Gentlemen," Pemberton began, "tonight you'll be carrying a new piece of equipment." He held up a brown paper bag filled with metallic strips. "This is Windows. It's tinfoil on paper. Every 60 seconds, you'll drop one bundle through the flare chute. The timing is critical. Use your stopwatches. Don't deviate from the schedule." A pilot in the front row raised his hand. "What's it supposed to do, sir?" "Confuse German radar, make their screens useless, make you invisible." Pemberton paused. "This is the first time we're using it. If it works the way the scientists say it will, your losses tonight should be significantly lower than normal." The crews absorbed this information with the practiced skepticism of men who'd heard promises before. New equipment often failed. New tactics sometimes worked, but usually got you killed in novel ways. Still, anything that might reduce losses was worth trying. The life expectancy of a bomber crew wasn't long enough to waste opportunities. They loaded the window bundles onto the aircraft. Each Lancaster carried approximately 7,000 bundles, stored in sections accessible to the wireless operator or bomb aimer, whoever was assigned the deployment task. The bundles were simple. Brown paper bags, each containing 2,200 strips of aluminum laminated paper. The strips were cut precisely, 25 centimeters long, 1 to 2 centimeters wide. Light enough to float, heavy enough not to tangle, cheap enough to manufacture by the thousands. Total material cost per bundle, negligible. The aluminum foil came from standard commercial sources. The paper was ordinary craft stock. Production required no exotic materials, no complex machinery, just cutting tools and patient workers. Britain had been stockpiling windows for months, preparing for the moment authorization finally came. Now, warehouses full of the stuff were being loaded onto bombers bound for Hamburg. At 2,244 hours, the Lancasters began taking off. 791 aircraft in total, drawn from multiple bomber groups, forming a stream 203 miles long. The formation was deliberate. Aircraft spaced at intervals, assigned specific altitudes to minimize collision risk, each crew briefed on their exact position in the stream. The bomber stream tactic, first used against Cologne in May 1942, concentrated overwhelming force through a narrow corridor of German airspace, saturating individual Himmelbett stations faster than they could respond. Tonight, the tactic would be augmented by Joan Curran's invention. The combination, untested at this scale, represented the most sophisticated air attack ever attempted. As the bombers climbed toward their cruising altitude and turned southeast toward Germany, German radar operators at coastal Freya stations detected them immediately. The massive formation was impossible to miss. Track plots appeared on screens at Luftwaffe command centers. Night fighter squadrons scrambled. Searchlight batteries powered up. Anti-aircraft gun crews loaded shells and waited. The Kammhuber line. 3 years in development. Hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks in investment. Prepared to do what it did best. Kill British bombers. What the German operators couldn't know, was that in approximately 1 hour, their radar screens would become meaningless. The sophisticated tracking systems, the carefully coordinated ground control, the years of tactical development, all of it would be rendered obsolete by paper and tinfoil dropped from the sky. Midnight, July 25, 1943. Himmelbettstation Manta, 50 kilometers west of Hamburg. Hauptmann Klaus Richter sat at his plotting table, watching the Freya radar display. The circular screen showed a long line of contacts approaching from the northwest. Nothing unusual. British bombers came regularly. Tonight's formation was larger than typical, perhaps, but not unprecedented. The RAF had launched 1,000 bomber raids before. Richter's station controlled a night fighter patrol zone 32 kilometers long, 20 kilometers wide. His equipment consisted of one Freya long-range radar with a detection range of 100 kilometers and 2 Würzburg precision tracking radars, each with a 30-kilometer range. The system worked through coordination. Freya provided early warning. When bombers entered the zone, one Würzburg locked onto the target. The second Würzburg tracked the assigned night fighter. Richter, watching both plots simultaneously, used radio to vector the fighter toward the bomber, guiding it close. Enough for the pilot's airborne Liechtenstein radar to acquire the target and complete the interception. The system had worked flawlessly for 2 years. Richter's station alone had claimed 43 confirmed bomber kills. Tonight looked like it would add to that total. At 0032 hours, the first British bombers crossed into his zone. Richter ordered his Würzburg operators to begin tracking. "Lock onto the lead contact," he radioed. The operator acknowledged. The Würzburg's dish rotated, found the target, began providing precise range and bearing information. Then, at exactly 0034 hours, the radar screen exploded with contacts. Not a few additional bombers. Hundreds. The circular display, which had shown perhaps 20 distinct targets a moment earlier, now showed an almost solid mass of returns. Individual aircraft became impossible to identify. "What's happening?" His Würzburg operator, a Feldwebel named Weber, frantically adjusted his equipment. "I don't know, Herr Hauptmann. The tracking radar is showing multiple targets. Dozens. I can't maintain a lock." The Freya operator reported the same phenomenon. His screen, which provided longer range but less precise data, now showed what appeared to be several hundred aircraft, where logic said there should be perhaps 50. The returns were multiplying, expanding, creating a cloud of false contacts that made actual target identification impossible. Similar reports flooded in from every Himmelbett station along the bomber's route. At Luftwaffe fighter control centers, senior officers watched in growing confusion as their carefully constructed defensive network stopped providing usable data. Night fighters circled their assigned patrol zones, radioed for guidance, received contradictory instructions. Radar-directed searchlights swept the sky aimlessly, unable to lock onto targets. Anti-aircraft guns fired at nothing. their radar-guided, predictors overloaded with false information. The German defensive system, built at enormous cost and developed with German precision, had been blinded in less than 5 minutes. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Above the chaos, Flight Lieutenant Morrison continued dropping bundles of window at precisely timed intervals. One bag every 60 seconds. His stopwatch told him when. His wireless operator, Walsh, handled the physical deployment, tearing open each brown paper bag and shoving it through the flare chute. 2,200 strips of aluminum-coated paper tumbled into the bomber's slipstream, dispersed into a glittering cloud. Each strip reflecting radar waves, each one creating a false return on German screens. Multiply that by 791 bombers, each dropping window at 1-minute intervals, and the result was a metallic storm stretching across hundreds of kilometers of airspace. German radar operators saw not 791 bombers, but what appeared to be thousands, a phantom fleet that overwhelmed every filtering technique, every identification method, every tactical response they'd developed. The Lancasters flew on, largely unmolested. A few night fighters found targets through visual acquisition, spotting bombers silhouetted against searchlights or fires on the ground. But the systematic, radar-directed interceptions that normally killed 4 to 5% of attacking bombers simply didn't happen. The Kammhuber line, designed to handle concentrated bomber streams, couldn't function when its primary sensor network reported useless data. At 0110 hours, the first bombers reached Hamburg. Pathfinder aircraft marked the target with colored flares. The main force followed, dropping a combination of high explosive and incendiary bombs. The attack plan was methodical. Blockbuster bombs to blow roofs off, buildings, followed by thousands of smaller incendiaries to start fires in the exposed interiors. The resulting firestorm would do more damage than the bombs themselves. The plan worked with devastating efficiency. Hamburg's fire brigades, already stretched thin by previous raids, couldn't cope with hundreds of fires igniting simultaneously across multiple districts. The conflagration spread. By 0200 hours, much of central Hamburg was burning. The fires would continue for days. Morrison's Lancaster completed its bombing run and turned northwest toward home. He continued dropping window bundles every 60 seconds, maintaining the protective cloud of false radar returns. Behind him, 668 other bombers completed their attacks and followed. Below, Hamburg burned. On German radar screens, the Phantom Fleet continued its impossible existence. Thousands of contacts that couldn't be tracked, couldn't be targeted, couldn't be stopped. When the last British bomber cleared German airspace at 0347 hours, Luftwaffe command centers began tallying their night's work. The numbers made no sense. 791 British bombers had attacked Hamburg. Conventional defensive tactics should have destroyed 40 to 50 aircraft, possibly more given the raid's size. The actual count, verified through wreckage analysis and prisoner interrogation over the following days, was 12. 12 bombers lost, out of 791. A loss rate of 1.5%, less than half the normal expected casualties. For the RAF, it was the most successful large-scale raid of the war to date. For the Luftwaffe, it was a catastrophe that suggested their entire defensive philosophy had suddenly become obsolete. But the full impact wouldn't become clear until German intelligence officers examined what British bombers had left behind. The morning after the raid, German civilians in Hamburg found their streets carpeted with strange metallic strips. Children picked them up, curious. Adults examined them, confused. Some thought the strips were propaganda leaflets that had failed to unfold. Others worried they might be contaminated with disease. That the British had deployed some kind of biological weapon disguised as harmless foil. The German military knew better. By noon on July 25th, scientists from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Air Ministry, were collecting samples from streets across Hamburg. They took the strips to laboratories, measured them precisely, analyzed their composition. The dimensions were familiar: 27 centimeters by 1.9 centimeters. The construction was identical to something German scientists had developed themselves 2 years earlier. The strips were Düppel, Germany's own radar countermeasure, invented independently around 1942 at a research facility in the Düppelheide district of Berlin. German scientists had conducted their own tests, achieved the same remarkable results, and reached the same conclusion as Joan Curran. This technology could blind radar systems completely. Then Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had personally ordered the research classified and forbidden its operational use. His reasoning mirrored Professor Lindemann's exactly. The moment Germany deployed Düppel, the British would capture samples, analyze them, and use the technology against German defensive radar networks. For over a year, both nations had possessed the same weapon, and both had refused to use it, each fearing the other would immediately copy and employ it. The stalemate had been a bizarre standoff of mutual restraint, driven by identical strategic paranoia. Now the British had broken that stalemate, and German scientists examining the fallen strips realized their defensive network had been defeated by technology Germany already possessed, but chose not to use. The irony was almost incomprehensible. 50 million Reichsmarks worth of radar equipment, the entire Kamm-Huber line defensive system, multiple years of engineering development, all rendered obsolete by a countermeasure that sat unused in German laboratories because military leadership feared exactly what had just happened. Germany's own caution had been turned against them. The very thing they tried to prevent by keeping Düppel secret had occurred anyway, because Britain had developed the same technology independently and chosen to deploy it first. At Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin, General Josef Kamm-Huber read the technical reports with mounting disbelief. His carefully constructed defensive network, the Himmelbett system that bore his organizational genius, had been defeated not by superior British tactics, but by strips of paper and aluminum. The realization was devastating. Years of effort, billions of Reichsmarks in investment, hundreds of radar stations, thousands of trained operators, all of it rendered ineffective in a single night by a technology Germany had invented first but lacked the courage to deploy. Kamm-Huber immediately ordered modifications to German defensive doctrine. Radar operators received instructions to ignore multiple small contacts and focus on large concentrations that might indicate actual bomber formations. Night fighter pilots were told to rely more heavily on visual acquisition and less on ground-controlled interception. Anti-aircraft batteries reverted to barrage fire patterns instead of radar-guided precision targeting. These were stopgap measures, tactical adjustments that acknowledged a fundamental strategic defeat. The broader implications were even more troubling. If the British had independently developed Düppel and deployed it without fear of retaliation, what else had they developed? What other technological surprises waited in future raids? The psychological impact on German defensive planning was profound. The certainty that had characterized Luftwaffe tactical doctrine, the confidence in technological superiority, evaporated overnight. Within weeks, German bombers began using Düppel during raids on British targets. On October 7th through 8th, 1943, just 10 weeks after Hamburg, Luftwaffe aircraft dropped their own metallized strips during attacks on London. But the German bomber force was a shadow of what it had been in 1940 and 1941. Most aircraft had been transferred to the Eastern Front. The few hundred bombers remaining in Western Europe couldn't sustain a campaign against Britain's now massive night fighter force and increasingly sophisticated radar network. British radar operators, warned about the countermeasure and equipped with newer centimetric radar systems operating on different frequencies less vulnerable to chaff interference, adapted more quickly than their German counterparts had. The centimetric radar wavelengths, around 10 centimeters, versus the 50 to 200 centimeter wavelengths of earlier systems, required much smaller chaff strips to create false returns. The strips Germany dropped, sized for older British radar frequencies, proved less effective against the newer equipment. The strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. Britain's decision to deploy window first, despite the risk of German retaliation, had paid off because the Luftwaffe no longer had the strength to exploit the countermeasure effectively, while Britain did. By early 1944, RAF Bomber Command was conducting raids with loss rates consistently below 2%, sometimes as low as 1%. The technology Joan Curran had perfected with household scissors at her kitchen table had fundamentally altered the aerial war over Europe. Back at the telecommunications research establishment, Joan continued her work. Windows' success led to requests for additional countermeasures. She developed variants sized for different radar frequencies, experimented with metallized strips that could fool German attempts to filter out false returns, contributed to defensive systems designed to protect British radar installations from German chaff. Her work remained classified throughout the war. Security protocols meant even her contributions to Window were attributed to male colleagues in official reports. She later described the most difficult period as the 18 months between inventing Window and its authorization for combat use. During that time, she watched RAF bomber loss statistics mount while a proven countermeasure sat unused in warehouses. The debate between Harris and Lindemann, between offensive capability and defensive caution, played out in war cabinet meetings, while bomber crews died at rates that might have been reduced if Window had been deployed sooner. The ethical calculation was complex. Deploying Window earlier would have saved RAF lives, but potentially exposed Britain to German retaliation using the same technology. The fact that Germany already possessed Düppel but chose not to use it was unknown to British planners until after Hamburg. From their perspective, the 18-month delay represented a reasonable strategic caution. From Joan's perspective, watching young men burn in aircraft that might have survived if her invention had been used, the delay represented an almost unbearable moral burden. After the war ended, recognition came slowly. Joan and her husband Sam both received honors for their wartime scientific contributions, though the specific details of their work remained classified for decades. Joan's role in developing Window became publicly known only gradually as wartime secrets were declassified through the 1950s and 60s. By then, she had moved on to other research, contributing to radar development for civilian aviation and continuing her work in experimental physics. She rarely spoke about the war publicly. When asked about Window in interviews decades later, she emphasized the collaborative nature of the work. The team of scientists and engineers who had contributed to its development and deployment. She downplayed her own role, describing herself as simply one physicist among many working to solve an urgent military problem. Colleagues disagreed. They described her as the driving force behind Window's development. The scientist who had seen the solution when others focused on more complex approaches. The final accounting of Window's effectiveness was stark and undeniable. During Operation Gomorrah's week-long campaign against Hamburg from July 24th to August 3rd, 1943, RAF Bomber Command flew 3,095 sorties. Total aircraft losses were 87, a rate of 2.8%. Prior to Window's introduction, similar raids had cost between 4 and 6% of attacking aircraft. The difference, roughly 70 to 100 bombers and between 500 and 700 aircrew, represented lives saved by strips of aluminum-coated paper dropped at precisely timed intervals from screaming bombers at 19,000 feet. The broader impact extended beyond Hamburg. For the remainder of 1943 and throughout 1944, RAF bomber loss rates remained consistently lower than they had been before Window's introduction. German night fighter effectiveness, which had peaked in spring 1943, declined substantially. The Kammhuber line, once the most sophisticated air defense network ever constructed, was forced into reactive tactical adjustments that never fully restored its effectiveness. American bomber forces, arriving in increasing numbers through 1943 and 44, adopted chaff, dropping as standard procedure during daylight raids. The 8th Air Force called it chaff rather than window, but the technology was identical. During deep penetration raids into Germany, American bombers dropped tons of metallized strips, creating radar confusion that reduced losses from radar-directed flak. The combined British and American bomber offensive, which destroyed German industrial capacity and forced the diversion of resources from other theaters, depended in part on a countermeasure a Welsh physicist had perfected by cutting aluminum strips with household scissors. The psychological impact on German defensive planning was perhaps equally significant. The shock of discovering that Britain had deployed a technology Germany already possessed but feared to use created uncertainty that affected subsequent tactical decisions. German military leadership became more cautious about assuming technological advantage, more worried about surprise deployments of British countermeasures, less confident in the invulnerability of existing defensive systems. This psychological erosion, difficult to quantify but real nonetheless, affected German defensive doctrine for the remainder of the war. Joan Curran lived until 1999, passing away at age 82 after a long career in physics and scientific research. Her obituaries mentioned window prominently, recognizing her contribution to one of the most effective tactical innovations of World War II. She never claimed to have won the war or changed history single-handedly. She described her work in characteristically modest terms: a problem that needed solving, a solution that happened to work, a contribution to a much larger effort. But the numbers told a different story. 70 to 100 bombers, 500 to 700 aircrew. Men who came home because German radar screens had been blinded by paper and tinfoil. Families that stayed intact because a Welsh physicist spent months cutting metal strips to precise dimensions and testing them until she found the exact size that made 50 million Reichsmarks worth of radar technology useless. The irony endured. Germany and Britain had both invented the same countermeasure. Both had tested it successfully. Both had concluded it would work devastatingly well. And both had refused to deploy it for identical reasons, each fearing the other would immediately retaliate with the same technology. The standoff lasted 18 months, a period of mutual restraint driven by mutual fear. When Britain finally broke the stalemate, Germany discovered its caution had been in vain. The thing they'd tried to prevent by keeping Doppel secret had happened anyway, because Britain had independently developed Windows and chosen to use it first. In the end, what saved lives wasn't just the technology itself, but the decision to deploy it despite the risks. Joan Curran invented Windows. Arthur Harris pushed for its use. The War Cabinet authorized it. And on the night of July 24, 1943, 791 bomber crews carried it into combat, trusting that strips of aluminum-coated paper would do what scientists promised: make them invisible to the most sophisticated radar network ever built. It worked. The paper and tinfoil fell through darkness over Hamburg, dispersed into glittering clouds, reflected radar waves, created thousands of false returns on German screens, and blinded a defensive network that had been designed to be invulnerable. By the time German scientists analyzed the fallen strips and realized what they were, it was too late. The damage was done, the advantage was lost, and 50 million Reichsmarks worth of radar equipment had become, in a single night, 50 million Reichsmarks worth of obsolete hardware defeated by household materials, cut to precise dimensions by a physicist with a green thumb for experimental apparatus. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.